All right, good morning. This is a summary for Monday, September 21st, and just wanted to get you up to speed with what we did in class today. Um, so most recently, we were talking about the conflict myth and the origins of the conflict myth, and largely we're doing this because we're trying to clear the rubble away for our conversation about the relationship between science and faith. Uh, Generally speaking, people have absorbed this idea that there's conflict between science and faith, and we've been trying to identify where did this come from so that we can move on and maybe even identify the weaknesses of the conflict myth as we talk about where it came from. So one of the things we did is we looked at the Enlightenment and we said, okay, people look at history sort of this way in terms of human progress and understanding, and there are weaknesses with this. The main weakness that we care about is this idea that somehow the church is responsible for the the lack of progress scientifically or technologically during what we would call the Middle Ages, what some people call the Dark Ages. But as we look at this, what we realize is during this time period, there isn't actually a lack of progress technologically, scientifically, morally, economically, geopolitically, over and over again. We actually see significant progress during what is the so-called Dark Ages. Therefore, the whole thesis that there is somehow conflict between science and faith that leads to a lack of progress for humanity, that's completely um, unfounded assertion historically. But what we also noted at the end of our last session together is this idea that many of the Enlightenment thinkers and those who followed after them believed that we were headed towards a modern secular age. They promised us, in a sense, secularization. And the secularization thesis is one of the more important and famous conceptualizations of history. Um, so what we want to do is sort of take a look at it, right? Secularization is a thesis we get from the Enlightenment thinkers, but it actually is carried on, as we see here, by some very famous intellectuals like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and Max Weber and Emil Durkheim. And what we notice is that they asserted that as society was modernized, it would lead to the decline of the levels of religion. Um, that 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 religious creeds would actually lose social significance as time went on. This was something that Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot and all those guys had said, but also was echoed by this generation of scholars as well. And moreover, they believed not only would religion disappear, but the world would actually benefit from it. This is because they believed in the conflict myth. They believed that the church was holding human progress back, that Christianity was responsible for a sort of glass ceiling in terms of uh, scientific understanding or technological progress or even uh, economic and geopolitical progress. This was already starting to lose some steam, even in the life of, for instance, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, you can see here, dies in 1939. And he actually dies just after escaping Austria, his home country, and Vienna, his home city, mostly for his professional career. At least he lived in Vienna. And he had to escape because the Nazis had just taken over Austria, and as a Jewish person himself, he was in grave danger. But this was actually problematic to his very thesis, his secularization thesis, because he was so sure that if the world had become less religious, things would be better. But what we find is, if we look closely, that Germany and Austria were among the most educated countries in the world. Actually, religion, while it was maybe lessening in its impact on the cultural structures of those two countries, what we find replacing it is actually itself very problematic. If the church was waning in influence in Germany and Austria, the problem is it's being replaced by fascist politics, which, by the way, has its own religious impulse. So what Freud is actually wrestling with the last few years of his life is this idea, wait a second, Maybe the world isn't actually going to get better as it gets less religious, and maybe it won't actually get less religious overall. Now, what we need to do is return actually to Draper and White. Draper and White, I very briefly introduced you to, and these two scholars were American scholars who were fully invested in the secularization thesis and had adopted it and absorbed it from Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and Max Weber and Emil Durkheim and all the way back actually into the Enlightenment. And they had been so sold out on the secularization thesis that they were willing to even try to promote it by false means. That is to say, when they wrote their books about the history of the so-called conflict between science and faith, they were willing to say things that they knew weren't true in order to try to promote and proliferate secularization. They thought, okay, the ends will justify the means. We're saying something that's not true, but in the end, this will be beneficial and be worthwhile. The best example I can give you from their work is that they are responsible, actually, for asserting that Christopher Columbus was the only person in Europe to know that the Earth is round.
Rebecca Cable, if you are in the building, please report to the upper school office. Rebecca Cable, if you are in the building, please report to the upper school office.
All right, sorry about that interruption. Anyway, they wanted us to think that Columbus was unique in his understanding that the world is round. Now, the reason they wanted to assert that is because Columbus came from a quote-unquote Christian Europe. For instance, he was Italian. That's where the Catholic Church is located in its headquarters, so to speak, in Vatican City. He sailed for Spain, one of the most thoroughly Catholic countries in the world, even today, really. And the truth is, what they wanted to do then is associate the church with ignorance. They wanted to say, look, Columbus came from these Christian countries or kingdoms, but those kingdoms were mired in darkness, mired in ignorance and superstition because of Christianity. Now, the truth is, he actually wasn't unique in knowing that the earth was round. Everyone knew that the earth was round. But remember, Draper and White wanted everyone to believe that there was conflict between science and faith, so as to discredit faith. So what we're realizing, the more and more we press on this thesis, is the more that it actually is, I would say, dubious, that it's not trustworthy. In fact, it is true to say that the secularization thesis has failed. It's been abandoned, somewhat surprisingly so. 100 years on from Sigmund Freud, 200 years on from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we find that basically the secularization thesis has been abandoned. There's an example I can give you here. This is a sociologist named Peter Berger, one of the more prominent and important sociologists of the 20th century. He was a major proponent of the secularization thesis, especially in his work in the 60s and 70s. What's interesting is that by the late 70s and into the 80s, and finally at the end of his career in the 90s, he had completely abandoned the secularization thesis. Here's why. He's from an interview near the end of his life. He says, I think that what I and most other sociologists of religion wrote in the 1960s about secularization was a mistake. Our underlying argument was that secularization and modernity go hand in hand. With more modernization comes more secularization. It wasn't a crazy theory. There was some evidence for it, but I think it's basically wrong. Most of the world today is certainly not secular. It's very religious. So this secularization thesis that's given to us by Enlightenment thinkers and passed down by scholars in the 1800s and absorbed by most of society is abandoned. Moreover, it's failed. It's incorrect. We might ask ourselves, why is it incorrect? Why isn't it playing out? Their theory that more education would lead to more secularization, would lead to more progress. Why isn't it playing out? Well, we could turn to the work of a man named Rodney Stark. He's a sociologist still working today. He's out of Baylor University. And a man who is well respected in his field, although he does have some controversial views that people are uncomfortable with. largely in response to like the Crusades, for instance. But that doesn't actually play a role here. He's actually, in this case, sort of summarizing scholarship that pretty much everybody agrees to sociologically. Here's what he says. He says, "For the truth is, religion is not passing away. Instead, it is very obviously making a great deal of headway around the world. Not only are there now few atheists in Russia, there are now millions of Christians in China. There are even signs that religion may be making gains in Europe. In most of Europe, the fertility rates have dropped far below replacement levels, with the impending consequence of rapidly declining native populations. What has gone little noticed is that the Europeans who go to church are continuing to have children, that this factor alone could result in a far more religious Europe. In addition, the impact of thousands of American missionaries has played a role in producing a quite significant Italian religious revival." So all that to say, the secularization thesis has largely been left by the wayside, and maybe it opens up to us fresh possibilities to reconsider that science and faith can work together, that modernity doesn't have to produce secularity, that education doesn't preclude faith, that in fact they work together. But of course, for us to really feel comfortable with that, we have to recognize that there's some counter evidence for our hoped for result. Our hoped for result is that we could see faith and science working together, but unfortunately, there's counter evidence like this guy. This is Galileo. Um, Obviously, very famously, Galileo did some science that brought him into some conflict with the church. Now, this is something that is actually very misunderstood, and I posted a chapter in Teams for you if you'd like to read about what happened to Galileo. It might be interesting to you to note that there's a lot more complexity to the case than most people understand, but I don't require it, and I don't want to necessarily bore you with the details. For us, what is important to note is that it is true to say that the church acted in a way with Galileo that we would critique, that we wouldn't celebrate. They did stop the work of Galileo on some level. So anecdotally, we could say, yes, this is a mistake of the church. This is a moment where the church is in disharmony with science. But it's just that. It's only an anecdote. And the truth is, we could actually marshal anecdotes in the other direction. We could say, well, you tell me about Galileo being in conflict with the church. I could tell you about Sir Isaac Newton, who actually is celebrated by the church for his accomplishments as a scientist, as a faithful Christian. Moreover, Galileo himself is a faithful Christian. We could use names like Copernicus and Kepler, and over we find these names of faithful Christians who are doing tremendous science. So what we realize is, while there are anecdotally plenty of moments that the church might have pause and cause to self-critique over its relationship to science, it doesn't in the end bear out historically that there is a necessary conflict between science and faith. Something I hope to demonstrate to you tomorrow. But there is one more point worth making today, and that is, many people might think that Galileo is the rule or is the norm within church history because today there is an unfortunate anti-intellectualism in the church, at least a strand of it. What is called fideism is actually impacting us in a sort of anti-intellectual way. Fideism is the belief that faith is more virtuous if it has less evidence or even no evidence. That belief, faith, is at its best when we don't require proof or support through any kind of evidence or argument. I actually think this is pretty problematic. There's probably going to be need for us to go over this tomorrow, but I want to say this first and foremost. We have set up the wrong synonym for the word faith. In our context, in this modern church, we think the word belief is a synonym for faith. But if we look at the lexical range for the word pistis, which is the Greek word that's used in the New Testament that we translate faith, a much, much better translation than belief would be loyalty. Loyalty and allegiance to Christ. And I'd like us to think about what it might mean to have allegiance to Christ with our minds. and how our faith and minds together propel us towards